Welcome to football's 5 unwritten rules. Number 1. Rooney against Man City, Ronaldo against Juve, Bale against Liverpool, Garnacho against Everton. These are all iconic goals, and all iconic goals with something in common. They are all overhead or bicycle kicks. You all know what I'm talking about. A player leaps into the air like the proverbial salmon. They swing one leg high up above their head to get themselves airborne, then they swing their other as hard and as fast as they can at that ball. Most of the time they're trying to score, and some of the time they succeed. And oh boy, when they succeed, it is beautiful. Some of the best goals the game has ever seen have been overhead kicks. But what does this have to do with football's unwritten rules, I hear you cry? There's no rule, either pro or anti, against overhead kicks, is there? Well, to see why overhead kicks are relevant, we need first to quickly look at one very much written rule in the big old book of rules. If we dust off the big book of football rules we've got here, we can scroll all the way down to Law 12. This law covers a great many things. Handball law, and to be honest, I'm surprised anyone on earth knows what the handball law is anymore, to the very serious offence of excessively using the VAR review signal. Look out everyone, he's excessively using the VAR review signal! But buried deep into this law is the playing in a dangerous manner section, which I will now read off the screen in the manner of the kid in the group presentation who doesn't do any of the work but turns up on the day of the presentation and just reads the screen. Playing in a dangerous manner. Playing in a dangerous manner is any action that, while trying to play the ball, threatens injury to someone, including the player themselves, and includes preventing a nearby opponent from playing the ball for fear of injury. Thanks, dude. Thanks for all your hard work on the project. Anyway, this is the section that covers what you and I would call the high foot rule. You know the one I mean. A bouncing ball that a player stretches for. He raises his leg just a little too high near his opponent. You know, maybe just around chest height. He gets the ball, but only because his opponent, quite rightly, doesn't fancy getting his head kicked off. But think about the famous overhead kicks you've seen. Aren't they basically all high feet? Sometimes a defender tries to head the ball at the same time, but wouldn't that mean the overhead kick, quote, threatens an injury to their opponent? Sometimes the bicycle kickist? Cyclist? Whatever. Sometimes the player doing the bicycle kick is high enough to be legally classified as in orbit. But wouldn't that, quote, threaten injury to themselves? Finally, what sort of person, other than the very craziest of centre-backs, sees a prime athlete with legs the size of tree trunks fly up into the air and swing their legs as hard as possible at the football and thinks, yeah, you know what, I'm going to go and try and head that ball away to safety. And that is certainly, quote, preventing a nearby opponent from playing the ball for fear of injury. And yet, despite all this, despite all these ways that overhead kicks and bicycle kicks seem to be obvious violations of a high foot rule, we all know if a player attempts an overhead kick, 99 times out of 100, the ref's not going to blow up for a foul. If anything, they'll do a little round of applause in their head. I mean, could you imagine the outrage of Rooney's goal against City or Ronaldo's goal against Juve being ruled out for a high foot? So what on earth's going on here? How come no one gets a foul against them for doing an overhead kick? Well, part of the answer is that I haven't been entirely honest with you. There is this little exception that I haven't shown you yet. A scissors or bicycle kick is permissible provided that it is not dangerous to an opponent. Isn't it beautiful? A law. A whole law dedicated to telling you to basically ignore 50% of what I just told you. If an attempt is as audacious, as beautiful as an overhead kick, then who cares about the safety of the guy doing the overhead kick or the chances of a defender not being able to play the ball? It's an overhead kick, for God's sake. We've got to value that. But we all know that this exception here is only part of the story. The real unwritten rule here is that overhead kicks are basically always allowed, even where they seem really dangerous to an opponent. I can count on one hand the amount of overhead kicks I've seen called as fouls in all my time playing and watching this sport. There just seems to be a worldwide agreement, an unwritten rule, if you will, that we can ignore dangerous play or the high foot rule, provided it is in the form of that most breathtaking of efforts, the overhead kick. And look, I recognise that this unwritten rule does allow players to get away with putting other players in danger, and that's not good. But Isn't there something really romantic, really pure in this age of using VAR or post-game shows to microanalyze every possible foul?
We'll have a look. Of course we'll have a look.
That this piece of athletic and technical brilliance is allowed not just to exist in the modern game, but it's celebrated as well. Number 2. We go now from an unwritten rule that seems to protect the romantic side of the game to one that seems to threaten it. This time, there's no real threat of danger. Well, at least not to the opponents. This is the unwritten rule against showboating. For some, the best part of football are the flicks and tricks of skilled dribblers like Neymar, Vinicius Jr. and Wilfried Zaha. But the opponents of these players are certainly not fans of this sort of behaviour. Any attempt to pull too ostentatious of a trick, even if that trick is serving a purpose, such as getting past a player, seems to violate an unwritten rule of football. No showboating. This particular unwritten rule seems to come with a very clear, unwritten punishment: getting absolutely clattered. Players take it into their own hands time and time again to enforce this rule with vigour. But sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, this rule goes from unwritten to written. Memphis Depay is to thank for one of these occasions. The Brazilian Football Federation has recently announced a new rule that mandates a yellow card for any player who stands on the ball with 2 feet. This new written rule came about because of the absolute uproar that occurred when Memphis Depay did this fairly recently in a league match. So this is an example of a showboat so egregious, an unwritten rule became written. But back to the unwritten rule and unwritten punishment. What's striking about it is that basically everyone accepts it. At least here in the UK. Biases aside, assuming you're not supporting or playing with either the showboater or the clatterer, most people accept that yes, you can showboat if you want, but then you've got to expect, and to some extent accept, getting clattered in return. So, unlike the overhead kick, where everyone is delighted that this beautiful aspect of the game is protected by an unwritten rule, the unwritten rule of no showboating without appropriate punishment seems to be an instance of fans and players alike accepting that sometimes you can have too much beauty in a game and it quite literally needs kicking out. Number 3. While we're on the topic of kicking the living daylights out of the opposition, let me introduce you to our third unwritten rule, the early reducer. This is the phenomenon of putting in a hard tackle on a player you're marking at the earliest possible opportunity in order to let them know what they're in for the next 90 minutes, and ideally to scare them into having a poor game. Admittedly, this was far more of a thing back in the days of the Wimbledon Crazy Gang, but it still goes on today in the professional game, and especially in amateur play. Anyone unfortunate enough to have played Sunday League in the last few years will have been marked by a man called Keith, or Keithy to his mates, the pub local who weighs 130 kilos and is very fond of an early reducer. But the unwritten rule here is not the fact that the early reducer exists. Instead, it's the unwritten rule that if you get your early reducer in early enough, you'll probably dodge a yellow card. That's right, you can absolutely clatter someone in what would seemingly normally be an easy yellow card and receive, at worst, a light telling off from the ref. That Vinnie Jones tackle I just showed you, he didn't even get a yellow for that. This is an unwritten rule backed up by the data. Here's a graph of various fouls. The light blue colour on this graph is a player's first foul they commit for that game. The x-axis is the percentage of the game played so far, and the y-axis is the amount of yellow cards handed out at this percentage of the game throughout the course of about 3 and a bit seasons. You'll notice that the graph remains pretty low for the first 7% or so of the game, which is roughly 6 and a bit minutes in. This indicates that our unwritten rule of getting away with your early reducer seems to be backed up by the stats, because far fewer yellows are handed out for a player's first foul if that first foul occurs in the first few minutes of the game, compared to if this foul occurs later in the game. Not only is this backed up by stats, it's also backed up by things proper football men can get behind as well. None of this dweeby laptop stats rubbish. Current and ex-players alike can often be heard talking about having a free hit in the early minutes of the game in which they can get away with a particularly dirty foul. Not only do the players talk about this, so too do the refs, such as Howard Webb, who has openly talked about trying to resist giving yellows in the early parts of the game in order to what he calls manage the game. So, the early reducer, a crunching tackle that terrifies an opponent but usually comes with very little punishment. This is an unwritten rule that's potentially declining but isn't going to disappear anytime soon, much to the enjoyment of Keithy and the rest of us who relish a bit of blood and thunder in our game. Number 4. Our next unwritten rule may well occur not long after an early reducer. Picture the scene. You're in the stand watching a game. Your team has the ball, passing it around at the back, looking to build an attack. Then you start to hear it, the boos and the whistles from the opposing fans. But you have no idea why. Basically nothing exciting is happening on the pitch, but then you notice it. The opposition players. They're all gesturing at the sideline, pointing at it frantically, like someone desperately trying to flag down a taxi or a bus. They have a man down injured, clutching his leg in this example. We all know what happens next. The ref is under no actual obligation to stop the game. There's no indication that this is a head or serious injury. Nevertheless, your team will kick the ball out for a throw-in. You know this, I know this, everyone knows this. Yeah, you'll probably boo a bit, and the guy behind you who's always talking about Fantasy Premier League in the middle of a match might say, you don't have to kick it out if he's not seriously injured. But in the end, we all know there's an unwritten rule here that your team has to kick it out of play. Not only does the unwritten rule say if a player goes down injured, eventually your team's going to have to put the ball out of play, it also stipulates that the opposing team have to give the ball straight back. This is seemingly a fully fledged unwritten rule system of what to do in the event of an injury that nearly all players seem to adhere to, even if they grumble a little bit along with the fans on occasion. Paolo Di Canio, for all of his many faults, knew about this unwritten rule when, in the year 2000, he caught a ball crossed into him and therefore passed up the opportunity to head the ball into an empty net after the opposition goalkeeper had gone down injured, but the referee had not yet stopped play. But sometimes, teams will not follow this unwritten rule, and my God, does all hell break loose. The year is 2019. Bielsa's Leeds take on Aston Villa in the Championship. The score is 0-0 in the 70th minute when a Villa striker goes down after a fairly innocuous tackle, not a foul by a Leeds player. The ref waves play on, and so Leeds do, with the Villa players doing the traditional waving and pointing at the sidelines. At one point, a Leeds player slows down and adopts the body language of someone about to kick the ball out of play. Villa relax a bit. But no! Instead, the Leeds player plays a through ball up towards Leeds striker, who, given that the Villa players are all now relaxed, isn't being marked. He therefore has an easy shot on goal, which he finishes with aplomb. It's now 1-0 Leeds. And it all kicks off. There's pushing and shoving everywhere, both on the pitch and on the touchline. In the maelstrom of it all, a Villa player is sent off, and eventually such a ruckus is made that Bielsa tells his team to let Villa score from kickoff. So we're left with this astonishing scene of a Villa player dribbling from kickoff uncontested and shooting past a goalkeeper who is standing out of the way. Well, almost uncontested. One man either doesn't get the memo or refuses to read the memo. Big Leeds centre-back Janssen tries his damnedest to stop the goal going through, even though his other 10 teammates are standing to one side. I mean, this was truly astonishing stuff, and as the commentator said at the time, we'd never really even seen something like this before. And the reason we've never seen it before is because everyone knows the unwritten rule to kick it out and then give it back, and nearly everyone follows it.
Brucey bonus.
Before we get to the final unwritten rule, which, to quote BuzzFeed, you'll never believe! How about a bonus rule? Let's go back to that game I talked about earlier, the one where a player went down injured and your team kicked the ball out of play. This time, it's the 89th minute, and your team is 1-0 down, but you've managed to get yourself a corner. The crowd are on their feet doing the best to suck the ball into the net. It's whipped in, but alas, the keeper comes out and claims it. Everyone knows what happens next. The keeper clutches the ball to their chest. They take a tumble and basically lie on the ball. They lie on the ball some more, and some more. He keeps lying on the ball. Then he gets up nice and slowly, all while the clock is ticking down and down, and someone in the crowd is screaming those familiar words. 6 seconds, ref! 6-second rule, ref! While someone else is dramatically counting the seconds the keeper is holding the ball. But both these people know, you know, I know, the keeper knows, hell, even the ref knows that nothing will be done. Even though the rules of the game say the goalkeeper can only keep the ball for 6 seconds. This is because there's an unwritten rule that you can basically ignore the 6-second rule for goalkeepers. They can hold on to it for nearly as long as they want and basically nothing will happen. Some goalkeepers have certainly made this an art form. I say nothing will happen, but what I really mean is nothing will happen this season. That's right, this unwritten rule is about to be cracked down on. A new worldwide rule will come into force for all levels of the game from next season. The 6-second rule will now become the 8-second rule. The keeper will not be permitted to hold onto the ball for more than 8 seconds, and if they do, the opposition will get a corner. Delightfully, the referees will enforce this rule with a very dramatic hand-in-the-air countdown for the last 5 seconds. How delightfully theatrical. So, while this is an unwritten rule for now, it won't be for much longer, so let's just have this as a nice Brucey bonus.
Number 5.
Okay, so here we are at the 5th, and for today, final unwritten rule. Now this one is fairly new, but my god is it serious. Violating it has quickly become one of the most heinous crimes a footballer can commit. I mean, I struggle to even talk about the sort of animals that would violate this unwritten rule. This unwritten rule: don't step on the badge. The badge! That symbol of your club, that indicator of its proud heritage and history. Unless, of course, you're a fan of one of those clubs who've redesigned it for more brand visibility. Do not besmirch such a thing by stepping on it. The badge! Worn proudly on replica kits by hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people the world over, who I'm sure all treat it very respectfully and don't, for example, risk spilling God knows what on themselves, their kit, and their badge every Saturday afternoon. But don't go stepping on it. The badge! The one that's either printed on the carpeted floor of the tunnel that players have to walk through to get to the pitch, or the one that's literally printed on the grass the players have to walk over to get to the pitch. But don't go stepping on it! How could you step on the badge? Like it's just some sort of image printed on grass or carpet, two surfaces people would actually normally walk on. How could you step on the badge and lose your opportunity to be featured on the next viral TikTok as #classy, #footballrespect, #respect? Clearly, this is one unwritten rule no one should violate. Thanks for watching Theorizing Football. Here we do thoughtful videos on the beautiful game. If you like the vid, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us what your favourite unwritten rule of football is. If you want to see some more, why not try out this video on defining world class in football, where I take you through common definitions of world class, definitions you might well believe in, and explain why they don't quite work.